From this video, you will learn how to create your own GitHub action with JavaScript. Hello, my name is Janne and welcome to another video. In a previous video, we learned how to combine actions created by other users to create workflows for our GitHub repositories. Today, we're going to build our own action. This action will be able to read markdown files from the repository, parse their front matter, and determine if one of them should be published based on the date parameter in the front matter. This action is personally useful to me because I want to be able to schedule my blog posts in the future. So if I combine this to a workflow with the netlify publish action, I will be able to schedule my blog posts. Let's jump to the computer and get started.
So I have just created this repository for our action, and I have also cloned it to my PC. Let's open it in Visual Studio Code. The first thing that our action needs is the action definition file. This is called action.yaml. So let's create that file, and to save some time, I'm going to copy and paste my action definition from my notes. This file follows the metadata syntax for GitHub Actions, and you can find the definitions from the GitHub documentation. This page lists all the available options. So let's see what we have here. The name of our action is publish schedule action. We have a short description, and after that we have listed the inputs and outputs. Our action will have two inputs. The first input is time range in minutes. This is the number of minutes that we want to include in the time range check to see if a post has been scheduled or not. So the idea is that if we set, for example, 60 minutes for the time range, the action would check that if there is a post that has been scheduled to be published within that hour. And the content directory parameter is the directory where the action should look for the markdown files. And the action will default to the root directory. It has one output called isScheduled. This is a Boolean value that indicates if content was scheduled or not. And this output can be used in later steps in a GitHub Actions workflow. Finally, we have the runtime definition. It's using a node 12, and the main file will be placed in a directory called dist, and the path to the main file is in dist/index.js. If we check the branding section from the documentation, we can see that we can also set an icon and color for the action. This will be shown on the GitHub Actions marketplace if you intend to publish your action to others. So let's quickly add a branding section to the YAML file. Here are the available colors. I think I could go with purple, and for the icons, a clock would make sense for a scheduler action. So define branding and set color to purple and icon, set that to clock. Okay, now GitHub will be able to understand our action. Now all we need to do is just to implement it. And that's easy, right? Let's open a new terminal. Because we are building a JavaScript action, you need to have Node.js installed on your computer. The first command that we need to run is npm init. I'll accept the default package name and the version. Let's copy the description from the YAML file. The entry point can be as default. I don't give a test command for now. Accept the default Git repository. And for the keywords, I'll set just GitHub Actions. Provide the author name. I'm using MIT license and approve. Now the package is initialized and we can start the actual implementation. Let's create the index.js file. This will contain all of the action logic. The Actions Toolkit is an essential resource for developing GitHub Actions, and you can find it from github.com/actions/toolkit. In this tutorial, we are only going to use the Actions core package, and we mainly use it for inputs and outputs. So let's install that package to our project. then we need to import it in our index.js file. Now let's take another look at the inputs that we defined in the action.yml file. First we have the time range in minutes. So let's define a constant time range in minutes. And we can use the core.getInput method and use the time range minutes key. And then we can define additional options. One of the options is that we can set this to be required. So if the user doesn't provide this input, then the action will fail. The second input that we have is the content directory. So let's also add that. Add another constant, call it content dir. And again use core.getInput content directory. This time we can set a default value to an empty string. So in this case, if the parameter is not defined, then we will still get an empty string. Now let's create a skeleton for the rest of the project. Define an asynchronous function called run that takes no parameters and does something. And then in the end of the file, we call that function. Now the main logic of the action needs to be included in this run function. The first thing that we can do is to set our output value to false at the beginning. We can do that with the core.setOutput. Select the name and give a value false. So now if you would call this action, you would always get false for the isScheduled output. Then what we basically need is to do something, and in case that there is a postScheduled, we should set core.setOutput isScheduled to true. But what do we need to do here? Well, the first thing that we need is the ability to look for markdown files inside the content directory and parse their publish date from the front matter. And luckily I found a package called recursive read there, which does exactly what we need. So let's install this package. So if we take a look at the library usage, we give it a path where we want to search for files. Then we can give an ignore rule for files that should be ignored from the search. Then we provide a callback function that handles the returned file paths. And it also supports the promise format. The library uses minimatch for the ignore strings. With that we can use wildcards to match file extensions. And we can also start the pattern with an exclamation mark to negate the value. So in essence we can build an exclusion rule where all files that don't end with .md are ignored. So let's get back to Visual Studio Code. I imported the recursive read there package. Now let's use the promise format. So we're going to await the recursive read there and provide the content directory as the first parameter. Then as the ignore list, we will set the negation of all files that end with .md. And as I already explained, this ignores all files that are not markdown. Then we define our fallback. The result will be a list of file paths. So let's define this parameter as files. and add the function body. Here we need to go through all the files and see if any of them needs to be published. So let's add a traditional for loop. And inside this loop, we can add an if clause. I'll call this if should publish, and give the files and give the current file as the parameter. Now, if this is true, then we need to set the is scheduled to true. We can also display an info message on the action execution. Like this. And because we know that at least one file needs to be scheduled, we can return from the function. Now we're left with implementing the should publish function. So let's define a new function. It takes a file name as a parameter, and the first thing that it needs to do is to read the front matter from the markdown file to get the publish date. So let's go to Google again. If you search for JavaScript front matter, you will find a library called gray matter, which does exactly what we want. So let's start by installing it. Now what does the library do? When you have a file that starts with a YAML front matter like this and has some content after it like this, you get back an object with the content and the parsed front matter data. And it's quite simple to use. The package contains a read function that can read a file synchronously from the file system and parse the front matter. So that's the one that we should use. I'm copying the import string and pasting it to my project. Now we can define the file equals matter.read file name. Now file is just an ordinary JavaScript object. So we can check if date is in file.data. And in that case, we need to do some calculations. Otherwise, we can just return false, because there is no way that the file should be published. Now the only thing that is left is to determine whether the date in that file is within the defined time range. And for that, we can use a popular time management library called Moment. So let's install it. Then import Moment. We can transform this time range in minutes to two moment objects that define the start and end time for the check. Let's start with the end time. So the end time is moment.utc, which get the current time in UTC, and we can set the second to 0. Now this makes sure that the start time is always consistent when we are starting the action. Then let's calculate the start time. And for that, we need to subtract the time range in minutes from the end time. We take the end time and clone it. This is needed because moment objects are always mutable. So if you would call subtract directly on the end time, that would change it too. Then let's parse an integer from the time range in minutes and define minutes as the time format for the subtract. Then backing the should publish function, we need to parse the date first. So let's define a new constant called date, which is equal to moment.utc from file.data.date. Then we can just return date is before end time and date dot is after start time. And now our action logic is finished. When you publish an action, you need to include all the dependencies with it. This speeds up the startup time and also means that the user doesn't have to install the dependencies manually. You could commit the node modules directory, but that's not very clean as it can contain thousands and thousands of files. The better option is to compile your action with all the required dependencies into a single file with a tool called ncc. So let's install that. Use npm install at virtual/ncc and save as a dev dependency. Next, in the package.json file, add a new script. I'll call this build. This will call ncc build index.js with output to dist/index.js and also with source map option. And this makes debugging easier. Now we can call npm run build. And now we have the compiled index.js file, which contains only the required dependencies. Notice that in the action.yml file, we set the main to this dist/index.js. If you're including the node modules instead, then you would of course need to point to this index.js file in the root of the repository. Then before committing, I need to edit my gitignore file so that I can include this dist directory. It seems to have added an exclusion rule that I can remove. Then let's finally commit this action to GitHub. Now on GitHub we can go and draft a release. So it seems that the action name collides with my previous tests and I cannot reuse this name. So let's update the name to markdown publish schedule. Commit the changes and try again. Now everything looks good. Let's set the primary category to publishing. Tag this version as 1.0. Name this initial release. And let's just describe this shortly. And then publish the release. It asks for a password and now it is released. You can see that there is now this marketplace link in the release information. If you click that, you can see it on the marketplace. Now let's try this out in my actions playground repository. Let's start by creating a new branch. And let's create a new file. I'm going to put a markdown file inside a directory called content. Let's just call this index.md. And it can be really simple. We just have a front matter with a date field and then some content. And commit that to the schedule branch. So I made a small error with the workflow implementation and I needed to record this last part again. Let's hope that it goes well this time. So let's switch to the schedule branch and create a new workflow. I will call this file schedule.yml. The name of the workflow will be schedule post. It runs on pull request. Typically, this action would run on a schedule, but for testing it's easier to run it on the pull request events. Then let's define the jobs. This will have one job called schedule, and that runs on Ubuntu latest. Then we need the steps. The first step uses the actions checkout version 2, which checks out the repository to the runner. The next step uses our new action at version 1.1. I also had an error in the ncc build command, so I fixed that off camera and bumped the version to 1.1. That's why it's different from what we defined here on the video. Next, the parameters. We set the time range in minutes to 720, which is 12 hours, and then define the content directory as content. Finally, we will need to set an ID for this step. I'll call this publish. We need this ID so that we can access the output variables in the next step. And the final step, I will give this name run something else. And here we use the if conditional. So you can run steps conditionally. All we need to do here is to write the rule. So we can access the output parameter of the publish step from steps dot publish, which comes from this ID. Then it has an object called outputs, and from there we define that it has the is scheduled output. Now, even though I set the output values as boolean, false, and true, the actual value that is seen in this workflow is a string. So we need to compare this against a string true. And you must use single quotes here because I tried double quotes and they didn't work. Now, if this condition is true, we can echo something to the log. So let's use the run command and echo it is scheduled. And this is our whole workflow. Now let's commit the file and go to the Actions tab. We have the schedule post action and see the logs. So if we check the logs, there is no output here, and the run something else step was skipped. This is because the markdown file inside the content directory was not scheduled for the previous 12 hours. Let's go and change the start time. So if I change this to today, to some time, let's say 4 o'clock, and then commit these changes. We should see that the action runs the other step too. Now the action prints out that content/index.md is scheduled, and the run something else step is also executed. So this action works as intended.
I hope you liked the video. If you did, press the like button down below and don't forget to subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.